It's a bit strange. Anuchard is a game that I kept putting off due to a lack of free time, but now that I've played it, it has honestly become one of the more enjoyable titles I have played so far this year. This is because while it doesn't do anything terribly unique, it does everything I wanted it to, just exceptionally well, even though sometimes it does get a little obsessed with donuts. Now, starting out with the gameplay, Anuchard wears its inspirations on its sleeves. Even within the first couple dungeons, you will see the similarities to games like Zelda and Terranigma as you find yourself fighting batches of enemies and solving basic puzzles to find your way through. For me, the combat, while being about as simple as those games, was definitely made a lot more interesting by the introduction of a shove attack that is needed to strip various shields off of enemies by bashing them into the walls. The effects of these shields can vary from simple damage negation to launching off projectiles or even spawning additional enemies, so choosing how to engage them was able to be made interesting without having to introduce complex player mechanics to deal with each one separately, since it's just shove them into walls when you're ready to deal with the side effects it shows off. And while they did fall into the trap of reusing enemy sprites by doing palette swaps and even scaling them up for some bosses, the introduction of new combat mechanics as well as strength and speed, of course, as they leveled up, actually made the advanced versions of the enemies feel more dynamic despite looking the same. For example, the simple cubes eventually drop turrets, the foxes go from swiping to launching exploding cries, and the magic rugs eventually leave trails of acid behind as they roll by that you have to dodge while fighting. This all makes the fact that there's really only a half dozen or so basic enemy types become a non-issue since they stay interesting as the dungeons get harder. Now, as far as the boss fights, in the normal dungeons you will face off against those scaled up versions of normal enemies, but as you approach the Guardian fights, each one of those will provide its own unique challenge, serving as a mix of puzzle and combat all in one rather than solely relying on simple attacks. Though I was mildly disappointed that the first 4 Guardians were far more interesting in this respect than the 5th, but they were all still quite enjoyable to fight. Similarly enjoyable, you might remember I also mentioned puzzles, and while there is some variance for side goals, such as hidden passageways, jump buttons, and teleporters, there was one consistent aspect of the puzzle's guarding advancement, and that was the interesting focus on the use of sending energy orbs towards various unlock points. Starting out simple with just straightforward aim and launch mechanics, it later on began involving toggling walls, teleporters, traps, and even activating multiple triggers with one ball, as well as having to redirect the ball mid-flight. And while this sounds super basic and repetitive, the reality is there was just the right amount of variety for the length of the game, so I never felt like I was repeating puzzles, since each one felt like a unique problem that steadily built on things I had learned before. Now, for the most part, I focused on the in-dungeon aspects, which is the majority of the game, since that's where you go to rescue the souls of lost villagers, as well as unlock the guardians of the island. But there are a few things to keep in mind outside of the dungeon as well. The big one you'll likely find yourself interacting with is food, since this provides you with damage and life bonuses, as well as some special combos and attacks during your adventures. This combined with various upgrades you can make in the town and such to expand your recipes, as well as unlock new healing towers for combat, and even some basic combat perks, does make doing your rounds in town between the dungeons somewhat useful, even though the game can be beaten without doing so. The last little bit of town, though, sort of skirts the line between story and gameplay, since between most dungeons, you'll find various side quests unlock, either relating to the characters you just rescued, or with villagers impacted by them. By doing these side quests, you'll unlock more of the story and learn more about the individual characters and their motivations, as well as the history of the island, and by doing them, you do fill up a bit of a trophy room. Though that kind of thing is generally unimportant to me, it is still nice as a visual reminder of completion that you can revisit as you play. I think the only semi-annoying aspect of the actual gameplay for me is the save system, though being a retro gamer, I am sort of used to dealing with it, and that is a lack of an autosave feature, so you need to revisit your main room to save, or you could very easily end up losing out on a lot of progress. Looping back into the story though, the actual advancement of Anuchard is a mixed bag, sometimes being extremely serious, other times being weirdly zany in its attempts at comedy, but overall striking an okay balance of screen time for each type of interaction, even if some do sometimes fall flat. Overall, even before I reached the second Guardian, I had an idea of where the story's path was leading us, which is very obviously a reflection on the desire for wealth, resources, and power, and the damage that can cause. And you can see a variety of perspectives in the commentary of the rather large cast of characters who range from altruistic all the way to self-centered, lazy, and greedy, though admittedly with the limited screen time we have for each of them in-game, they can sometimes be a little two-dimensional, but it is fine for the scope of this title. And through this, I actually expected a bit more of a black and white decision for how the ending occurs, but there is a little bit of give and take between the endings that keeps either from being purely good or bad, but I do feel there is a bit of a lean into one being more right than the other. Now, as you can probably tell by the background footage, the aesthetic of the game is a bit more cartoony, and is quite well done, as is the music, though don't underestimate just how dark the game can get because of this appearance, since there are undertones of things like Soylent Green and even acts of converting lost souls into slave labor, not to mention touching on subjects such as classism and war, though it does take a little while to reach that point, and it does not go into deep gory details, but rather just directs discussion and reactions to it. And in the end, I enjoyed my time with it, and I think it was just the right length for what it delivered, taking about 8 to 9 hours to casually move through and explore, but it could easily be beaten in far, far less, and while it's nowhere near as large in scope as its retro counterparts, it is just a nice weekend dose of Zelda-like fun in a well-polished package. And if you want to see the full playthrough, it will be available over on the Let's Play Everything channel, and you can catch future games we will be covering over on the Twitch channel. And as always, a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and Twitch subs that make this content possible.